Thanks for joining us for this video. Today we want to talk to you a little bit about off-grid tool essentials, and that is saws. In particular, we want to talk to you about getting saws that are high power consumption and use lots and lots of gasoline, like this amazing saw. Just kidding! We want to talk to you about saws that do not require power. In today's day and age of electricity and fuel, we have a lot of modern technology that is very, very nice to have. However, out here, where we're off-grid, it's not always convenient to try to put electricity where we need it or to use fuels for other purposes. So, we've actually started using a lot of these hand saws. We want to talk to you a little bit today about how all of these power tools have not diminished the effectiveness of these hand saws, which have been put together over hundreds of years, and the technology is very well established. So let's talk a little bit about some of these saws. We'll kind of give you some pointers in case you want to start looking for these at garage sales, maybe on Craigslist, estate sales, things like that. It will be money well spent for you. So first I want to just share a couple of different saw types so that you know what you're looking at when you discover one. These are hand saws, of course, and these are particularly a rip saw, and they're designed to cut with the grain of the wood. So when you're trying to cut the length of a board, this is what you would use. Highly recommend you have at least a single rip saw in your toolbox in case you do need to either finish some sort of a joint that you're cutting, maybe with a power tool, or maybe you want to cut that joint simply by hand. The reality is these tools have much more control, and it's much easier to make precise cuts without making mistakes. So this is a rip saw, and the reason we know that is simply because the tooth only cuts on the push stroke, and the teeth are staggered left and right, and they don't point backwards, they only point forwards. So a rip saw, those are the characteristics. You can almost always identify them just by the sheer size and lesser number of teeth. You'll see when we talk about a crosscut saw how they're very, very different. This set of saws are what are called crosscut saws. They are designed to cut across the grain of the wood. So if you're trying to cut the end off of a board, these would be the ideal saw for that. Of course, there are finely tuned saws for very specific applications, but if you can have at least one good crosscut saw in your toolbox, you'll do really well. These finer tipped saws probably aren't well suited as your only saw, so if you can find one with a nice strong back, that would be a good thing to look for. A characteristic of crosscut saws is that the teeth cut on both the push and the pull stroke, and they're very small teeth. So usually there's a lot more teeth per inch on a crosscut saw. So if you can have at least a single crosscut saw in your toolbox, you'll be well to do. Another note on these types of saws, the place to look for these would be garage sales or estate sales, so you'll have to kind of keep an eye out for those. And the reason is these saws will last generations. In fact, a couple of these saws were my father's and my grandfather's, and they've built many, many homes and schools and other public buildings. And so the best saws out there are just hand-me-downs. So very carefully look at these garage sales, maybe even ask if they have any hand saws that are available. A couple of things to look for. You just want to make sure that the saw has all of its teeth, hasn't been broken or dropped or damaged, something like that. And just give a quick look to the teeth and make sure nobody's done any weird filing or grinding or anything on them. And then probably the most critical thing is just to make sure that the saw is straight. If it's got any kind of a bow or bend or anything in the blade, that's exactly how it's going to cut. So make sure you're buying straight saws. Another advantage to these antique type saws is that they can be maintained over your lifetime. They're actually serviceable and can be sharpened. There's only a couple of tools you would need, and again, no power is required. So what you would be looking for is what is known as a saw file, and these are almost always triangular, and there will be different sizes, and you'll want to look for those in order to make sure that you're able to cut the right tooth. The other thing that you will need for the rip saw is what's called a saw set. A saw set will help you to maintain the staggering of the teeth on your rip saws. So it's important to know that these saws can be serviced throughout their lifetime. That'll be important. We'll talk about some of the other saw types and why they cannot be serviced. Next, let's talk a little bit about some of the utility saws that we use. First, let's talk about this folding saw. A couple of reasons that having a folding saw around is super helpful is the ability to hide the blade. So I will often throw this in my back pocket when I'm heading out to do a project just because of its ability to protect the teeth. If I try to stick this saw in my pocket, you can imagine what will happen. Additionally, they're very, very sharp, and they function a little different than a typical handsaw. They're known as a pull saw, which is a Japanese design. So that means that it cuts on the pull stroke instead of the push stroke. Makes it a little easier to control, and you can be a little lighter with the force, whereas when you're pushing, you tend to bite in a little bit more. So it's a really nice saw. This one is made by Home Planet Gear. It's called an Eversaw. It's actually one of the top-rated saws on Amazon. So if you're looking for a folding saw, definitely give this one a good look. Another unique characteristic I do like about this is that you would think saw companies would figure this out, but when you close the saw, it doesn't cover up this eyelet. So that's just one of those silly things I see on saws all the time. Whenever you hide the blade, you can't use the eyelet anymore. Kind of annoying. So recommend having some sort of hideable blade saw just for utility purposes around the property. Next thing is kind of just a generic handsaw. And what makes this one unique is this one has carbide teeth. That's important. They're very, very hard, which means it keeps its edge very, very well. And so it's just a good all-around saw. The bad news, which I shared earlier, is you cannot sharpen this saw. Cannot be sharpened. If you try to sharpen it, you'll probably either ruin your file or probably ruin the teeth. So this is kind of a throwaway saw, which is why it's important. These saws are not very costly. And so if you need to do kind of a boogery type cut, something you wouldn't want to use your nice antique saws on, this is a good saw to do that with. We use this for just about everything, and I honestly don't care too much if the teeth end up in the dirt or against rocks or other non-desirable things for saws. So if you can find yourself a nice little utility saw like this, it'll do you well. Next, let's talk just really quick about this. It's called a hacksaw. This is a small version, really useful for around the house doing household projects. There are more robust models which are designed for heavy work, but this basically is designed for cutting metal. Very, very fine teeth will take care of plumbing and cutting nails, screws, things of that nature. So if you can find a hacksaw to put in your toolbox, it'll be really useful when you need to cut metallic objects. These two saws are fairly unique. This saw in the back here is known as a back saw, and the reason for that is it has a stiffened spine. It's important because it's meant for cutting very precise cuts. And this yellow box that goes with it is called a miter box. This box allows you to put the material in the middle and then slide the saw into this guide, and now you can cut a very consistent angle. This is really helpful when you don't either have the ability to run your chop saws, miter chop saws, etc., or you're working on smaller, more delicate projects. This saw is very precise, and it doesn't require power. This is also a back saw, but it's specifically known as a dovetail saw, and as you can tell, we keep the edge protected. So also has a very rigid back on it and has, again, even smaller teeth, and it's a bit more narrow. So this is for cutting very precise cuts. I've obviously designed for dovetailing, but can be used for extremely delicate cuts. This is fun to use on cabinetry, picture frames, things of that nature. All right, and there's one last saw that I'd like to show you, but you're gonna have to back up. Nope, keep backing up, just back up a little bit more. All right, that's probably good. Okay, you're good. All right, the last saw that I want to show you is this Crosscut Saw. Also a bit of an antique, and also man-powered. This saw can cut almost as quick as a chainsaw when it's fully sharpened. And it's a one-man saw, so you can pack it in, pack it out. The steel that these saws are made out of is incredible and very, very durable, and again, can be passed on to other generations. So, again, if you're at estate sales, Craigslist, Facebook, eBay, garage sales. Take a look for these types of saws, and if you find one, put it in your collection. What you want to look for is try to make sure that you find one with all of its teeth, because a lot of these get dropped or they've been mishandled throughout their life and they'll be missing a tooth or two. If it's missing a couple teeth, it's not the end of the world. Also, look for one that hasn't been mis-sharpened. You want to make sure that the teeth look like they're fairly even. If they look like they've had a grinder or some heavy filing on them, probably pass on it, unless you want it simply for the novelty's sake to put in your living room. But this saw is still a very useful tool. We'll be using it around the property, and it's kind of fun too. Alyssa likes it a little bit. So, that's a little bit about saws, and we encourage you to keep an eye out for these types of saws as you go about. They're really useful tools, especially for off-grid, but honestly, they're really good to have in your toolbox all the time. If you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more about our off-grid homesteading project, please follow us on our blog. It's purelivingforlife.com. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll put a subscribe button right on the saw. If you love Facebook and Instagram, we have one of those too. We'll put a link in the description below, and please follow us over there. Unfortunately, I can't put a link to these on Amazon because they don't have them, but we'll also put a link for the other products that we have below if you'd like to take a closer look at those. And we'll see you in the next video.